a lot of it is just around alignment. Teachers right now are not incentivized to offer kids more creative and personal forms of writing. They're incentivized to basically prepare kids for things like the ACT or the AP exams. And those forms of writing are very sort of argument focused, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just there's not enough balance. And one of my hopes is that these developments around AI and ChatGPT will give policymakers and give sort of the education system more permission to let teachers encourage kids to do more creative and personal writing.
Welcome to Our Burning Questions, a professional learning podcast where we answer your most compelling questions about teaching, serving, and supporting multilingual learners. I'm your host, Jasmine Coaxum, and through our talks, I look forward to bringing the methods, philosophies, and stories behind teaching multilingual learners to light. Let's get into the show. Chris Ma is a PhD candidate at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. He studies learning technologies, teacher education, and writing. He started his career in online ad sales at Google, then taught high school English in Minneapolis, working with students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Okay, so here with us today on Our Burning Questions is Chris Ma. Hello, Chris. I'm so glad that you could join us today. So first, I want to let the audience know a little bit about your current role in education, or I will let you tell us a little bit about your current role in education.
Sure. I guess I'll go backwards. So right now I am a PhD candidate, so graduate student in education at Stanford University Graduate School of Education. I mostly do research on learning technologies, teacher education, and writing. And so right now I'm very deeply immersed in the AI and writing world. I have a teaching background. Before this, I taught high school English and ELs in Minneapolis. And then before that, I actually started my career in tech. And so this has been the merging of two career strains for me. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so from your profile, I could see that you've worked at Expedia and even at Google. So, I'm really wondering what inspired you to become an educator of Ls or MLs. So what led you to the education field?
Yeah. So I come from a family of teachers, and teaching had been something I'd always been interested in, but I did the thing you're supposed to do when you have a fancy degree, and I went into tech by accident. I worked for about 7 years in tech, and I had a lot of great experiences. It was really interesting work. But at the end of the day, it came down to just wanting to have a more of a purpose-driven profession. I think a lot of people tell you life is too short to not follow your passions, but I actually think it's the opposite. I actually think life is too long. So your working career spans a long time. I wanted to do something that felt more purposeful for me. Education had been my path to a better life. And so I wanted to help make that path a little easier for kids like me. So I switched careers, became a teacher. I taught in Minneapolis for about 5 years. And I was really interested in working with ELs in particular because as a second generation Chinese American, I grew up in a household where a mix of non-standardized English and Chinese were spoken. And so I saw the way that language and standardized English can be a gatekeeper for a lot of kids. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where my passion laid, was just helping kids gain the language skills they need, and also to be able to critique the way that language holds so much power. And so I worked with kids from all different linguistic backgrounds, not only ELs, but kids speaking non-standardized forms of English, tribal languages, Somali. And Minneapolis is actually a very interesting city linguistically. I'm happy to get into that a little bit more, but that's kind of my background and how I came to the work.
I really love that you have addressed this idea of language and power. And in this episode, we're going to dive more really into AI and chat GPT and what kind of role it's playing or could potentially play in terms of education and the strength behind language. Are we really using the power of language that we actually have as human beings to our full advantage, or are we using it only enough to an extent where a bot can come along and then mimic it, right? So what is giving us that unique power in terms of language and how we're teaching it and how we're using it? You mentioned this, but I'm just going to reiterate that your research focuses on writing, multilingualism, and tech. And so you wrote an article earlier this year titled ChatGPT Will Fundamentally Change How We Teach Writing. That's a good thing. In this article, you say that ChatGPT is often generic. It's better at mimicking the style of others than producing an original voice. So providing students with more opportunities for personal and creative writing positions them as experts and helps them develop their unique voice. So I was wondering if you could give our audience an example of how educators could implement this type of personal and creative writing during class time.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Right now, one of the things I'm working on actually is developing an AI powered pre writing tool to help students write college essays. And so the idea here is basically schools don't actually spend a whole lot of time teaching narrative writing and especially personal narrative writing. And a big reason for this is because a lot of our standardized writing assessments focus on argument. And I can go on a whole tangent about that, but I'll try and stick to your question. The college essay is a personal narrative, and so it's very high stakes, but a lot of schools just don't teach it as a style. And one way, and actually one way that AI can help students in this process is by acting as a brainstorming partner. The tool I'm working on developing, one of the things we do is we use AI to help kids see lots of examples of strong and weaker college essays. College essays are difficult to find online. You can actually find really strong ones from sites like Johns Hopkins University, but one of the principles of learning sciences is that students actually need to see examples and non-examples to get a good understanding of, in this case, a writing genre. So we use AI to do a Mad Lib style game where kids can choose they can construct like an applicant profile, someone who is a star soccer player but grew up experiencing homelessness. And AI will just generate a good and a bad example of that student's essay. And so students can compare, what made this essay stronger than this one, even if it's on the same topic. And so that's one of the components of really smart pre-writing, is just being able to be familiar with a genre and to understand what a good example and a bad example looks like. So that's one example of a way that AI can support students in more personal writing. And to your original question of like, how can teachers actually do more of it in the classroom? I think the answer is just do more. AI cannot mimic a kid's personal writing. And so giving kids an opportunity to write about their personal experiences is something I think a lot of teachers want to do already. They enjoy reading kids' personal writing. A lot of it is just around alignment. Teachers right now are not incentivized to offer kids more creative and personal forms of writing. They're incentivized to basically prepare kids for things like the ACT or the AP exams. And those forms of writing are very sort of argument focused, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just there's not enough balance. And one of my hopes is that these developments around AI and ChatGPT will give policymakers and give sort of the education system more permission to let teachers encourage kids to do more creative and personal writing.
And that's really just it's such a wonderful kind of, I don't want to call it a dream, but goal, a wonderful goal for this tool, for the emergence of this tool. So, and I'm really glad that you brought up this whole idea of alignment and how it really affects a lot of what teachers end up presenting to students in the classroom as activities or as ways that they should be creating, let's say. And I really feel that Obviously there are other types of writing, right? I mean, we all know that there are other types of writing, and I really feel that those other types of writing should definitely have more of a place in education. Another thing that you said along these lines in the article is that many teachers align their writing instruction to mimic these standard writing assessments, and in doing so they really reduce the art of writing to these generic 5-paragraph essays. So I want to know, really, I guess, how does ChatGPT affect
Yeah.
how educators should shape these high stakes standardized writing assessments maybe going forward? And how do you suggest educators try to implement this shift if this shift is coming upon us as a result of ChatGPT?
Yeah. So I'm not a policy expert by any stretch. And I think the framing for me is less around how educators can force this shift and more around um, how designers of assessments can form better assessments.
Yes.
As long as the AP exam and the ACT kind of incentivize teachers to teach this narrow enactment of argument writing, that's what a lot of teachers are going to do, because teachers care about their kids. They want them to have access to higher education. And so they're going to do what they think is going to prepare their kids for that high stakes assessment. So I really do think it's the responsibility of a lot of test designers. And if you keep going down the chain, part of that is colleges and how they evaluate their applicants. As long as colleges place bigger and bigger emphasis on standardized writing assessments, well, that's going to be the benchmark. So I think a lot of universities are moving away from this. They do see how some of these standardized assessments can be problematic. And so that's a shift that I think is slowly starting to happen. Again, I'm not a policy person, so I might not be the best person to describe how that shift happens when the rubber hits the road. But I can tell you why I think those assessments are problematic and what I think a better alternative is.
Okay. Would you like to share with us what you think a better alternative is? We would love to hear this.
I've got a whole rant prepared about standardized writing assessments. I think if you take a look at standardized writing assessments, a typical one is, here's 60 minutes, read these 3 short artifacts, read these 3 short articles, or read these 3 short texts, and then go and write an argument about it. And if you think about that, it just in no way approximates what authentic writing is. Authentic writing is not time-bound, especially not with that little time. Authentic writing has a real audience. It's not just a test reader that's reading it. Authentic writing is writing that has a real authentic audience. I would also say real writing involves process. It involves adequate time to plan, to draft, to receive feedback, and to revise. And none of those things are possible in sort of a narrow standardized assessment. And then the other thing is, these types of assessments, oftentimes what they're doing is they're assessing everything around writing. They're assessing time management. They're assessing reading comprehension in a lot of cases, and especially background knowledge. And I think some people might argue like those things, you can't separate those things from writing. And that's the point. If you're going to assess kids on writing, you also need to give them adequate time and support on all those other things, all those other processes that are involved with strong writing. To me, those standardized assessments of writing just are not actually assessing writing. They're not authentic in any way. They just don't approximate the types of meaningful writing kids will do in college and in the workplace and outside of school too. So that's my diagnosis of what's problematic.
Now to the solutions, yes? The bright spots, or what can we do moving forward? Okay.
I favor a more sort of holistic approach to standardized writing assessments. I think it's also really important to distinguish, are you trying to assess a kid's knowledge and understanding of the topic, or are you assessing kind of their mechanics of writing? Because those two are really different things. If you're just assessing content knowledge, and anybody who's taught L's should be able to tell you this, I'm not saying anything particularly new here, but if you're just assessing content knowledge, you also need to be giving kids lots of opportunities for different ways to demonstrate their knowledge.
Yes.
So speaking and discussion is a great way to assess content knowledge. Having kids do multimodal assessments So maybe they're using some kind of a presentation, or they're using images as part of their way of demonstrating knowledge. So writing is a really important skill, but it shouldn't be the only way that we assess kids' content knowledge. And then I think as far as what the day-to-day teachers can do, the big reframing I would like to see is moving away from this idea that writing is only a form of assessment and shifting toward a world where writing is also a way of thinking. Letting kids do low stakes, frequent writing as a way of them thinking, as opposed to a way of them demonstrating knowledge. That's the big shift I'd like to see, and I hope that AI speeds up that process.
So what do you think it would be about AI or about something like an app or something like Chat GPT that could actually help us speed this process up?
Yeah. So I think ChatGPT in particular has been a catalyst for a lot of conversations that should have been happening anyways around writing.
Yes.
So the idea that, the fact that a machine can quickly churn out formulaic writing, templatized writing, standardized writing, it should force us to question why we value those types of writing. ChatGPT can do a lot of things, but I think what it's best at is stuff that is familiar. It's trained on data that it's trained to approximate the middle of the bell curve. And oftentimes what that looks like is a 5-paragraph essay or a pretty straightforward argument essay. And so I think if a machine can do these things really well, one, it suggests that people might need to do less of this in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really, I can't underscore that point enough. So if in the future machines are going to be doing a lot of the sort of like templatized, standardized writing, whether that's form letters or just anything that's really predictable, then people should probably be focusing their energy on other types of writing. So we really need to be thinking about the types of writing that we're preparing kids to do, not today, but 5 years from now or 20 years from now even. And I think this is applicable to lower grades too. What are the types of writing that kids will need to do to be successful in 15 years? And I don't think that the 5-paragraph essay has ever been that. And more so now than ever.
Okay. This is just going off of your background, your intuition, your thoughts about this. What do you think are the knowledge keys that children will need for success going forward?
It's so hard to predict because, one way to think about it is through an economic lens. That's not the only way and certainly not the healthiest way, but it's the way that a lot of people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And, so when you think about the future and the future of work, I don't know what the statistic is, but 10 years from now are the types of jobs that will be important 10 years from now. We don't even know what those are right now. And this is why I keep coming back to this idea of writing as thinking, because that I think will never change. As humans, language is inexplicably tied to how we create meaning, how we think. Language is our symbolic system that we use to form meaning. So using writing as a tool to think, I don't think that will ever go away. I can definitely see a world in which like machines are doing a lot of the writing that's sort of just purely functional.
Mm-hmm.
Machines will never replace like writing as a way of thinking as long as language exists in the way that it does. And so I'm getting very sort of abstract here, but the concrete point here is basically students should be having lots of opportunity of low stakes writing as a way of thinking. And that I think will provide the foundation for whatever types of different writing they'll need to do in the future.
Now, I mean, yeah, it's a little abstract, but not really, right? So my point is to draw out of you an example of writing to think. So we're so used to getting these prompts in order to encourage this standardized type of writing. But what kind of, let's say, prompt would an educator need to be given in order to facilitate this more like thinking, writing as thinking?
That's a great question. And I'll give you an example that cuts across content areas in case you've got listeners that are science teachers or math. Mm-hmm. Argument writing is everywhere. You can find it in biology class. You can find it in social studies class. So instead of just an argument where it's, hey, here's a really complex issue, take one side or the other and then argue for it. That's a really reductive way about thinking of argument. And so as a writing to think tool, something a teacher could do is they could assign maybe some sort of a thought journal where kids are actually tracing the evolution of their thought through writing. So maybe initially they just write an entry about what they already know about a topic. Let's say the topic is something like mandatory voting. So they're going to write a little mini journal entry about what they already know about mandatory voting. And then as the unit goes on and they're reading articles and they're watching videos and they're hearing different perspectives, they can just continue to journal and trace their thoughts and write in more of a dialogic way where they're in conversation with, hey, I watched this politician give this speech. I saw this campaign advertisement about ranked choice voting. And so like in thinking of writing as a dialogue where you're just bouncing ideas off of another text or another student, that's much more in line with this kind of writing to think approach than, okay, we're going to read all these things, we're going to have a discussion, and then you're going to just write to prove what you know. That's writing as an assessment. And that's the world I want to move away from, and more of a world where writing is actually a way of thinking.
Wow. And I think that's a really great and really practical tip or practical idea for educators to implement in their classrooms, just starting to rethink how we're encouraging writing in the classroom, and dialogue is definitely a big part of that. So you mentioned, I'm glad that you mentioned something about dialogue, because in one of the podcasts that you were on and you were talking about, I think it was the Cult of Pedagogy podcast, and with that particular podcast, which was talking about ChatGPT as like an example machine. You talked a little bit about the conversational nature of ChatGPT. So right now, I mean, you just mentioned the picturing writing, or I want to say teaching writing in this dialogic kind of manner. But if we want to take that into the positive aspects, or what we can use ChatGPT to do, can you just unpack a little bit about this whole idea of it being conversational and how that can be used to our advantage?
Sure. I'll give you a specific example with some kids that we're working with. So my advisor and I, actually, Sarah Levine, who did that podcast with me, we're working with a group of kids at a local high school, and we did just some really preliminary research around how kids might use it. And so we gave them an argument task because, really representative, for better or worse, of what happens in schools. And what we found was a lot of kids were actually using ChatGPT to just brainstorm counter arguments. And I think it was such a cool little example, because if you think about it, most students don't write in community with people. They go home and they write on their laptop by themselves. And it's very difficult it's very difficult to have a thought partner when you're just sitting at home on a laptop, or in a lot of cases, a phone, and typing. So ChatGPT can stand in as just a thought partner. And I think there's a real risk of, maybe not a risk, I think there's a mistaken impulse to compare ChatGPT to like an expert teacher. And so you can say, of course, like ChatGPT will never be as good as a teacher. If a kid just asked the teacher that question, the teacher will be much more skilled at dialoguing with them than a machine. But I think that's actually the wrong comparison. I think the comparison is actually nothing, because that's the reality for a lot of our students. Is they go home and they have no support. If they're lucky, they've got parents that are home and are able to help them. But in most cases, in a lot of cases, kids are left to their own devices. And so having basically a little AI thought partner that they can bounce ideas off of is really important. So that's just one small example of how ChatGPT can be a thought partner. I will kind of preface this, or I will kind of caveat all of this by saying that I don't think ChatGPT is a particularly good student-facing tool at this point. It takes some kind of practice, trial and error to prompt it to help rather than just do the work for you. So I don't think ChatGPT in its current state is a great tool for kids to be using without some deliberate coaching. But I do think that there are things that are being built using this technology that are already making big leaps and big improvements. There's already a number of kind of AI writing companions out there that do a much better job of, for instance, asking kids questions rather than just like giving them an answer. And so that, I think, is a really promising step forward. My other soapbox issue right now is just AI literacy. So I really do think AI literacy is the next big equity issue, and that teachers, students need to realize that it's not going away and start thinking about, like, how do we use these technologies in ways that support our learning rather than undermine it.
Right. And unfortunately, I mean, it took such a long time for educators to realize this about even the internet. Okay, like how we should start partnering up with what's going on in terms of the internet, in terms of social media, in terms of everything that has developed over the last, I don't know, 20 years, 15 years at this point. It took a long time for educators to jump on that bandwagon and say, oh yeah, this is doing nothing but advancing. How can I work hand in hand with this? And so I'm really glad that you brought up the statement about ChatGPT in its current state. I heard you on the Elevation, the Highest Aspirations podcast, and you said that this is the worst the technology will ever be.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned, though, that at present, ChatGPT is trained on data that stops at 2021. I was actually in shock. Talk about literacy, okay, on ChatGPT. I was like, what? Really? 2021?
That podcast was less than 6 months ago, and already it's outdated because it's caught up. And now I think
Has it? That was
data is up to April of this year or something.
Oh, really?
That is the speed that everything is moving. And that's because it's moving so quickly. I think it can feel overwhelming for educators to feel like, oh, this is just one more thing I need to learn how to do. Yes. But I do strongly feel that this is the next big equity issue. And that is the nature of technology. It disrupts, it changes work, it changes jobs, it changes the nature of work. And so I think you brought up the analogy of the internet and social media, and I think it's a good one. Like, social media, basically nobody saw the damage that it was doing, and it went unregulated and unchecked for a decade before people started to wake up and see, hey, this is causing really severe mental health declines among young kids and young girls especially. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to see us make that same mistake with AI. Mm-hmm. A teacher that I worked with this summer who described this kind of denial almost, or unwillingness to engage with it, as AI abstinence only. And that's what I think that type of thinking was really prevalent last year. Mm-hmm. And because ChatGPT kind of was dropped right before the holiday break. And I think administrators just wanted to pray it away and pretend it wasn't there. This year, I've been getting a lot more requests and inquiries about professional learning around AI. So I think we are waking up to it collectively, and I don't think it's too late, but we definitely need to establish some guardrails and just some competencies around what that looks like.
So, I mean, this sounds very exciting, and I love this idea, and I'm sure there's some educators that are going to be listening to this that are like, wow, yes, I actually want to get my hands on some professional development surrounding AI. Do you have anything coming up, any projects you're working on to facilitate some PD around this?
Yeah, I work with a couple different teams here that are doing piecemeal requests and partnering with schools and districts just to do foundational AI literacy. One of the big challenges is nobody knows what AI literacy actually is yet, what we need to know, what we don't need to know. And it's changing so quickly that something we say today might be totally irrelevant 6 months from now. And so that's definitely one of the challenges of keeping pace with innovation. I would say if educators are interested in learning more about it, there are great resources online. The University of Pennsylvania actually just released like a 4-session course. I think some of these are paid, but there's also free resources from sites like code.org. There's a number of free resources that are just online. YouTube is a great resource too. And I'm happy to share some links after the podcast is over to direct teachers in the right direction.
Okay, fantastic. So, I want to ask you, based on your tech studies, your tech background, what kinds of upgrades do you envision in terms of the evolution of this tech? Again, this is just going based on intuition, just sheer thoughts on the upgrades that might happen with this tech.
So I'll preface this by saying I have a background in tech, but not on the technical side. I was on the marketing side more,
Okay.
but I do think there are some really promising directions that this technology can take. So one is multimodal. So right now, ChatGPT, the ChatGPT that most free users are familiar with is text only. And already ChatGPT can do things like look at an image and interpret it or do voice to text. So multimodality is definitely a game changer. Think about the implications that has for Ls especially to do speech to text is really cool. Same with students with disabilities, vision impaired or hearing impaired students. Those types of things are super, super powerful. There are already sites out there or apps out there. There's one called Magic School, which I think is pretty neat. It was developed by teachers. And it's basically, they have taken ChatGPT and they've just put a prettier user experience on it that's developed for teachers. So basically anything a teacher could ask ChatGPT to do, give me ideas for a lesson plan, help me create materials, help me differentiate texts. They've put it in a neat looking user interface that's very teacher friendly. And I think that's a great use case. And then OpenAI, the company that built ChatGPT, they literally last week they released this capability called like custom GPTs. And it's basically create your own little virtual assistant. And it can actually do the things that ChatGPT can do, but it can do things like interface with your calendar and search the web and do some other interesting things.
Wow.
So again, I will caveat all this by saying there are plenty of not so great uses for this powerful technology that can and will happen, but I don't think that should stop teachers from still using the technology to support their students and to help make their lives a little bit easier too.
Okay, so we definitely need to talk about the hesitation, right, of educators in using this, right? So something that you said is that ChatGPT and AI pose real and consequential risks for educators and students, but they also present a window of opportunity to accelerate needed reimagining of what we teach and why. So please, if you can just unpack some of the fears surrounding the use of ChatGPT from the perspective of educators, and then how you think maybe we can overcome those fears and then basically can reimagine what to teach as a result.
Yeah. So I think two things can be true, and that is AI is going to do a lot of harm, and AI can and hopefully will do a lot of good. And really, how much it does each is partly dependent on how teachers approach it, at least in the educational context. So the things teachers that I work with are most concerned about are misinformation, bias, and toxic content. So we know ChatGPT is built on language models that just reproduce what it's been trained on. And so if the training data includes data from the internet, well, the internet is maybe a little bit of a racist place sometime. And so ChatGPT is going to reproduce that. There are ways to mitigate it on the technical side, but a lot of it does come down to sort of careful engagement with the tool. If a teacher is going to use this and put it in front of kids, they need to prepare kids for the type of content they're going to get back. They need to teach kids that, hey, this model doesn't actually know anything. It's just predicting the next word in a sentence. They need to teach kids like, hey, this model is trained on data that might say something sexist. And so those are two big ones. Obviously, learning loss and cheating are huge ones. Happy to talk more about cheating. I'm doing a study right now on some teacher beliefs around cheating. Other ones are just like a growing technological divide of people that have access and people that don't. And then also a lot of teachers are worried about how AI might impact their jobs and the professionalization of their jobs. I think those are probably the biggest ones that I've heard from educators. In terms of like how to overcome it, I think overcoming is not quite the word that I use, because I think those are all healthy fears. And I think we need those fears. We need to be afraid of misinformation. We need to be afraid of toxic content and bias, because if we're not afraid of it, we won't sort of confront it.
Right.
So I think some of that fear is actually really healthy. And we want to teach kids that, like, those are some of the limitations. At the end of the day, I do think it really does come down to literacy. Again, I'll come back to that social media example. Can you imagine if 15 years ago or 10 years ago we had said, here are some of the risks of social media. Let's teach kids how to use it more responsibly. Think of all the harm we could have prevented.
Mm-hmm.
I think using one specific example of AI can create culturally insensitive content. Yes, there's a huge part of that is inherent in the technology and the training data it's trained on. And a big part of that is, hey, developers of this technology need to just find better ways to train these models so they're producing less problematic content.
Hmm.
But I don't think that sort of dismisses teachers from any responsibility either. I mean, teachers all have a responsibility to be sensitive to cultural difference too. And even if a tool creates racist content, part of it is the teacher also needs to be able to use a tool in a way that's culturally responsive. So I think the big message is there's lots of stakeholders. Everybody has a role in kind of shaping what responsible use looks like. The last thing I'll say on this point is I've been using the term AI literacy a lot, but a teacher that I worked with this summer, she was saying, I actually prefer the term AI citizenship because it's more of an active connotation, because kids are they're not just consuming this stuff, like they are future producers of content too. And a lot of that content will be sort of AI supplemented. Already AI is embedded in Google Docs. Already it's embedded in things like
Yes.
YouTube and these everyday products and tools that kids interact with. As I'm talking about AI literacy, maybe the term I should be using is AI citizenship, because we're all kind of consumers of it and we are also participating in producing it too. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. And then, I mean, what would you say are the top three really, I guess, useful case scenarios for educators of L's, ML's in terms of chat GPT? So, we just talked about the fears and like maybe what we might consider a negative side. So what is for the teachers who are like, yeah, I'm ready to totally embrace this thing, especially if it's going to help me with my profession, with what I'm doing with my students. What are maybe the top three use cases?
Great question. And thank you for limiting it to three, because really it's kind of just limited by your imagination. So one for L's in particular, translation. So I think with Google Translate, like you can translate, but it's a little clunky. At least with more widely spoken languages, my experience has been that ChatGPT has been pretty good with translation. And translation is really important. I want to stress this point, especially my lens is always writing. And a big piece of writing is background knowledge. If kids don't have knowledge about what they're writing about, they're going to struggle to write. I think the piece around translation is really important to me, because if a kid is trying to write on a topic that they don't feel confident in their knowledge of, they're going to struggle. And struggle is not always bad. But if you can give a kid an article in their native language, let's say Spanish, give a kid an article in Spanish, have them read it in their native language, and then maybe give them an English version, but maybe it's at a lexile that's a little lower than what they actually can read. And then you give them another version of it that's a little higher than what they can read. So now they've seen the same article three times, once in their native language and twice in English at a couple different levels. That kid's going to have a much, much stronger understanding of the content of that article than if they just read it in English at one lexile. Mm-hmm. So ChatGPT can help differentiate that experience for them and help them build background knowledge so that they can feel more confident in writing. So that's one, is translation. The second, which is related to the example I just gave, is differentiating text and really differentiating any materials. So differentiating text, a lot of teachers are probably familiar with Newsy LA, the website where here's an article about electric cars, and we're going to give it to you at a 800 lexile, a 1200 lexile, and a 1600 lexile. That's great, but ChatGPT can do that for anything, not just the articles that's in their library. So if you want to take an article on housing discrimination, and it's an Atlantic article that's 1400 lexile, but you've got kids reading at 1800, 1200, and 400 lexile in the same classroom, Well, now you can make different versions of that same article, and kids can access the same content at the appropriate independent reading level. And so I think just in terms of differentiating texts quickly, that's a really big game changer. You can differentiate not only text, but you can differentiate other materials too. So oftentimes teachers create outlines for their kids for writing, and you can ask ChatGPT to create 3 different versions of an outline with different levels of scaffolding for whatever your kids need. That's 2, is differentiating materials. And then the third one actually is what my advisor and I talked about on that Cult of Pedagogy podcast that you referenced, which is using ChatGPT as an example machine. So a lot of what teachers do is they show kids examples, and
Yes.
it takes time to write and generate appropriate examples. So in that podcast you mentioned, we talked about this learning sciences concept called contrasting cases. It's basically examples of something that is similar on the surface but has deep differences. So the way this might look in like a social studies classroom is, say your kids are doing something like they're writing a letter to their congresswoman to argue for mandatory voting. What you can do is you can ask ChatGPT to create 5 different examples of the opening paragraph, but each paragraph should be written in a different tone. Each example should be written in a different tone. So you can have a friendly tone, a professional tone, an angry tone. And so you can ask ChatGPT to make these contrasting cases, print them out, you give them to kids, you shuffle them up, and you can have them sort them. Which do you think is most persuasive to least persuasive, and why? And now you're just asking kids to talk about tone and audience and purpose. And they can open up these really productive conversations with one another about the impact of certain word choice and tone. So those are the 3 big ones: translation, differentiation, contrasting cases. Those are strategies teachers can use like today or tomorrow in their classes.
Great. Okay. It's really been fantastic talking to you about this subject, about AI. And for our listeners who want to follow your developments and more of your work and discussions on this, what is the best way that they can do that?
I thought about you sent that question over beforehand, and I realized I have no social media presence or anything.
I just thought you were in a hurry. Ladies and gentlemen, I send over like a little Google form that asks my guests for this, and his didn't say anything. I was like, oh, yeah, he probably was just in a hurry. That's why.
No, I have basically no. This is actually a fault of mine. I don't have a social media or anything like that where I'm updating where I'm sharing some of my research.
You're a busy doctoral student.
I'm happy to share my contact information and some links to work that myself and my team have done.
Okay, fantastic. And so I am going to ask you a final question that I like to ask all of our guests. So what burning question should today's educators consider in order to improve their service to the L and ML community?
All right, I actually wrote this one down, so sorry if the screen is blurry for you.
It's okay.
Sure. I wrote this one down because it was such a good question.
Thank you.
I sort of alluded to this before, and I approach this question very humbly as someone who does focus on AI. I think that this type of generative AI and large language models specifically are going to dramatically shift the type of language skills that's necessary for academic, professional, and social success. So I think the big burning question is, what types of language skills will ELs need to be successful in 5 years or 20 years? And really taking that long view of how is this going to change what's important, what skills are important. As teachers, we're all very familiar with backwards planning. And so trying to think of like the desired end state of what does success look like for kids and what are the language skills they'll need to get there. That is what we should be designing curriculum towards. And I think for a long time, that has not been reflected in the way that we teach and evaluate language skills and writing in particular. So I think that's the question I'll leave listeners with is, what are the language skills your kids will need to be successful in 5 years and in 20 years?
Okay. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to our audience today on Our Burning Questions. Chris Ma.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to Our Burning Questions, produced by Mid-State Auburn at OCM BOCES. If you would like to learn more about today's guest or any of the resources we discussed, please visit Mid-State Auburn's webpage at ocmboces.org. That's ocmboces.org. Join us next time where we hope to answer more of your burning questions.